On the day my father remarried, the air outside the hotel tasted of incense and expensive perfume, the kind that clings to your throat and pretends it belongs there. I was small enough to be mistaken for luggage. Dressed in a stiff lace dress my grandmother had altered with sharp stitches and sharper silence. People smiled at me like they were practicing for photos, then turned away as if my face might damage the event. My father, Koa, kept his hand on the small of his new wife's back, a possessive gesture disguised as tenderness. Lan, everyone called her Lan because it sounded younger than she was, tilted her chin and accepted congratulations as if she had earned them. They said my mother's name only when it was necessary, and even then it came out like a cough, quickly swallowed. I did not know what death meant yet. I only knew the house had become quieter after my mother stopped moving, and quiet felt like permission to breathe. The adults called it misfortune. They said Min had been weak, unlucky, dramatic. My paternal grandmother pressed her finger against my forehead and hissed that I was a bad omen, a little comet that had burned my mother to ash. Somewhere in the background, music tried to insist that happiness was happening. My maternal grandmother, Mrs. Q, arrived late, her hair pinned into a hard coil, her mouth a line that would not soften. She looked at the red paper cutouts, the white flowers arranged like fake innocence, and then looked at my father as if he were a man she had measured and found hollow. She did not scream. She simply took my hand, and her grip was the first thing that day that felt real. A year later, they held a banquet to celebrate my half-brother Kwang's first prize at school. A full-month-style extravagance translated into modern vanity. The restaurant glittered with chandeliers that did not belong in a city that still smelled of rain and motor oil. My father wanted to invite business partners and pretend success was hereditary. Lan wore a dress the color of ripe lychee and carried Kwang on her hip like proof. Mrs. Q came with me, not because she enjoyed parties, but because she had never learned how to let an enemy enjoy peace. The waiters rolled out a cake taller than my chest, frosted in cream so white it looked like a lie. Speeches began. Glasses chimed. Someone praised my father for being a devoted man who rebuilt his family. I watched Mrs. Q's knuckles whiten around her teacup. When my father smiled and raised his glass, Mrs. Q stood. She did not ask for the microphone. She didn't need one. She had rage, and rage carries. With one decisive shove, she overturned the nearest table. Plates skidded, soup flew, chopsticks clattered like startled insects, gasps erupted. My father shouted her name, not in grief but in fear of public embarrassment. Mrs. Kyo grabbed the cake as if it were a weapon she had been waiting to hold. She hurled it across the room toward my father, Lan, and the baby in Lan's arms. Cream exploded over Kwang's face, over Lan's dress, over my father's proud suit. Kwang screamed, a frightened, strangled sound, and then he stopped making noise altogether. His face turned a dangerous shade of red. Adults surged forward, arguing, panicking, blaming, saving face, even while a child couldn't breathe. In the crush of bodies, someone shoved me aside like an object in the way. I fell. The world snapped into sharp fragments. A shard of broken porcelain found my arm and sliced a long line through skin that had already learned pain. Warm blood ran to my wrist. I stared at it, fascinated by the honest color. Only when someone noticed the red did they remember I existed. "Quick, hospital!" my father barked, as if a public wound was worse than a private one. In the emergency room, the air smelled of disinfectant and wilted flowers left by people who had already given up. A nurse with tired eyes, Nurse Dao, her badge said, sat me on a bed and peeled back the sleeve of my dress. She cleaned the fresh cut with practiced care. Then her hands paused, not because the cut was deep, but because she saw what lived beneath it. Bruises in different colors bloomed up my arm, faded yellow beside new purple, like a calendar of harm. She lifted the hem of my dress just a little, the way you check a child for fever, and found more. Her face did something I had never seen an adult face do for me before. It hardened for my sake. The doctor leaned in, eyes scanning my ribs, my thighs, my shoulders. "How did this happen?" he asked. I could speak by then, technically. Words existed in my head like birds behind a cage, flapping too fast to catch. I looked at my father. He looked at the floor. Lan looked offended, as if my bruises were an accusation against her aesthetic. My paternal grandmother snapped that I was clumsy, that I fell a lot, that children were weak. Nurse Dao didn't argue. She simply stepped out and returned with a uniformed woman whose expression was calm in a way that made it heavy. Officer Tran introduced herself softly, as if she didn't want to frighten me with authority. She asked my father to explain. She asked Lan to explain. She asked my paternal grandmother to explain. They spoke over each other, their stories too fast, too defensive. Then Officer Tran turned to me and waited, giving the silence a place to land. I stared at the pale hospital curtain and tried to understand what truth cost. Mrs. Q arrived before my father could decide which lie to choose. She pushed through the crowd, saw the bandage on my arm, and saw the old marks the adults had pretended were invisible. Something in her broke and sharpened at the same time. "Now you call the police?" She snarled at my father, voice low and lethal. "You should have called them years ago on yourself." For once, my father's face lost its performance. He looked like a man who realized the audience had changed. My mother died when I was 3, and adults tell stories about that age like it's a fog where memories can't survive. But some things sink deep because they are repeated. I remember shouting, not because I was sad, but because shouting was the only volume in the house that got attention. I remember my father slamming doors. I remember my mother's crying that went on until one night it stopped. They said she became ill suddenly, that she refused to fight, that she had no will to live. People said this with the same tone they used for broken appliances. My paternal relatives said it was better she died, that she had been a burden, that she had brought bad luck to my father. Mrs. Kyo dragged me to my father's home after the funeral, demanded answers, demanded accountability, demanded something she could hold. My paternal grandmother pressed her finger against my forehead so hard I stumbled and told Mrs. Kyo to take her comet away. My father was on a honeymoon with Lan, starting his new life before the old one finished decomposing. When he returned, he came to the altar with 3 sticks of incense and the expression of a man doing paperwork. He crouched to my height and said, "Come home with me. Your grandmother isn't stable." Lan handed me a lollipop, smiling like someone who believed sweetness could buy morality. Mrs. Q snatched it, crushed it under her heel, and then, because she couldn't bear my gaze on the sparkling shards, struck my cheek. "Your mother is watching," she hissed, and her grief turned into discipline, because she had nowhere else to pour it. That was the first time I truly cried loud, sudden, helpless, because pain finally gave my body permission to make sound. People later called me odd, in the careful way they use when they want to be cruel without consequences. A doctor once suggested autism. He said my senses were too sharp, that the world was too loud, that I retreated because I could not filter. Adults repeated his words the way they repeated my mother's supposed weakness, using labels as if they were explanations and not responsibilities. When my parents fought, they did it in the same room where I played, as if my small ears could be ignored. When they ran out of arguments, they ran out of patience, and my body became a convenient place to leave anger. After the divorce, I stayed with Mrs. Q for a while. She discovered bruises when she changed my clothes and cried for a long time, not in front of me, but into her pillow where she thought I couldn't hear. Then money got tight, and my father's family demanded I return, claiming they were taking responsibility. Responsibility, in that house, meant being useful. My father was building a business and had no time for a child who didn't laugh on cue. Lan was young, pretty, hungry for praise. She treated me like a doll she could display to neighbors to prove she was kind. She tried to teach me to call her mother. When I didn't, she settled for auntie with a smile that soon curdled into irritation. When she became pregnant, my paternal grandmother treated her like royalty and treated me like a shadow that needed constant sweeping. Auntie Lan started finding fault with everything. My chewing, my breathing, my silence. My paternal grandmother called me unlucky, insisted I would infect the baby with misfortune, and began policing my existence like it was dangerous. The bruises did not come from one hand alone. They came from a household that agreed I deserved them. There were moments of accidental mercy, and I learned to collect them the way children collect pretty stones. My mother's younger sister, my aunt, visited once and found me dragging a broom taller than my body, my stomach hollow, my hair tangled. She scooped me up and carried me out as if theft was the only honest form of rescue. Mrs. Q scolded her for bringing me back, calling me a burden, a hindrance, a reminder. I understood even then that my grandmother's love was braided with resentment. She could not hold me without also holding my father in her mouth like a curse. Still, my aunt tried. She fed me quietly. She washed my hair gently. She called me by my name like it was something worth saying. My father arrived that night to drag me back, furious that someone had exposed the truth beneath his walls. Lan and my father argued because my bruises were too obvious to deny when sleeves rolled up. Lan claimed she hadn't meant it, that I made her nervous. that I didn't react right, that I was wrong in ways that frightened her. Then my half-brother was born, and the household shifted its worship fully onto him. My father looked at me in the hospital corridor and smiled with relief, as if the baby had saved him from failure. Someone had told him my birth chart brought luck, that my presence could turn danger into opportunity. Only he believed it. My paternal grandmother spat that I would poison the boy's future. I sat in the corner with my hands folded and watched adults pray to different gods. Money, sons, appearances. One of my earliest clear memories is not of a beating or a scream, but of chocolate. The day after my mother's funeral, I sat on Mrs. Q's porch steps, legs dangling, watching ants carry crumbs like they had purpose. A boy from the neighboring lane wandered over with dirt on his knees and kindness on his face. He didn't ask questions. He didn't tell me to smile. He simply pushed a square of chocolate into my palm and whispered, as if sharing contraband, "Don't cry. This helps." The sweetness melted on my tongue and made my whole mouth feel warm, a tiny, illegal comfort. I didn't finish it. I hid the rest in my pocket because I wanted the warmth to last. By evening it had softened into sticky paste, glued to fabric, proof that even good things could turn messy if you held them too long. Mrs. Keogh found the stain and scolded me for wasting food, for being careless, for making life harder. I didn't explain. I didn't have the words to say I had been trying to save the only gentle moment I owned. Years later, when Lamb offered me chocolate by the hospital window, the memory returned so vividly I could almost smell the old porch boards and the dust of that lane. I understood then that my life had been stitched together by small acts of witness. One boy offering sweetness, one nurse refusing to look away, one officer waiting for my voice. None of them could erase what happened, but each of them widened the crack where light could enter. Lon's childbirth was difficult, and stress made cruelty sloppy. In the hospital room, my paternal grandmother brought a thermos of chicken soup so thin it looked like water, and scolded Lon for wanting more. Lan snapped, flung the bowl to the floor, then threw the thermos as if it were a grenade. Hot broth splashed across the tiles and across my leg, and pain exploded bright and clean. I screamed then, a pure animal sound that made everyone look at me as if I had chosen to be dramatic. Lan tried to stand, jolted her stitches, and cursed at me for existing. My paternal grandmother grabbed the baby and hurried out, muttering that I was ruining everything. In the mess, Lan finally understood she had married into a house that would never cherish her either, only what she produced. She demanded divorce. My father responded coldly. She could leave, but his son would stay, and she would take nothing. My paternal grandmother told Lan to get out if she wanted to keep causing trouble. Lan swallowed her anger because she had no power without my father's name, and she decided that if she could not win the household, she would at least control one thing: me. When Mrs. Keogh heard, she arrived to take me back, not out of tenderness, but out of strategy. She patted my head and murmured, "Good. Make them suffer." It took me years to understand how heavy it is to be raised as a weapon. Back in the present, Officer Tran's questions in the hospital finally forced the adults to stop narrating over me. My father's face twitched between anger and calculation. Lon cried loudly, insisting she loved me, insisting people misunderstood, insisting the bruises were accidents. My paternal grandmother screamed that Mrs. Q had poisoned me against them. Mrs. Q, in return, accused them with a hoarse, raw voice, listing every time she had seen marks, every time she had been turned away, every time her own grief had been dismissed. The police took photos. Nurses wrote notes. The hospital filled out forms as if my body were a document. By the time my arm was stitched, my family's story had become evidence. My father's business contacts, the men he had invited to the banquet, heard what happened. He lost more than face. He lost deals, trust, the smooth narrative he used like currency. Suddenly he stopped wanting me. The man who once claimed my birth chart brought luck decided I was, after all, a bad omen, not worth the risk. Within days, he returned me to Mrs. Q's apartment with a bag of clothes and a look that said he was relieved to be rid of responsibility. Mrs. Q opened the door, took the bag, and stared at me with disappointment sharp enough to cut. "Why didn't you destroy them completely?" she asked, as if a child could aim tragedy like a dart. I did not answer. My throat still held too much silence. Mrs. Keogh stepped aside and let me in anyway, because hatred needs a home too, and I was the only living place she could keep her daughter's memory burning. Life with Mrs. Q was safer in the way a locked room is safer. The danger stayed outside, but the air inside could still sting. She stopped the heavy chores. She stopped the beatings because there was no one to beat me but herself, and she refused to be seen as that kind of grandmother. But she did not become soft. Her affection came in practical portions: rice cooked, tuition paid, a new notebook slid across the table without comment. She rarely praised. She often blamed. Still, the absence of daily terror gave my mind space to reorganize itself. In second grade, my teacher accidentally handed me an intermediate math worksheet meant for older students. I finished it quickly, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because numbers stayed still when I looked at them. Letters used to dance. Numbers behaved. The teacher visited Mrs. Q and spoke excitedly about testing my IQ. Mrs. Q stared at me like I was a puzzle she hadn't known she owned. She agreed, mostly because it was free. The result came back: 130. Experts explained that autistic children sometimes developed intense focus in specific areas. The school began offering counseling, structured support, quiet rooms. Slowly, the letters stopped leaping. I learned to read without feeling attacked by the page. By middle school, I topped the county rankings. Neighbors who once called me stupid began calling me gifted, as if the bruises had been a necessary tuition fee for intelligence. Mrs. Q started buying me better pens, better uniforms, sometimes even a new dress, though she complained the whole time that money should be saved for emergencies. I understood her conflict. She wanted to love me, but every time she looked at my face, she saw my father's blood and remembered her daughter's coffin. I grew up with a strange philosophy that made adults uncomfortable. I didn't crave grand declarations of love. I craved absence of harm. If someone did not hit me, did not yell, did not demand I perform gratitude, I counted it as kindness. That lowered bar kept me alive, but it also trained me to accept too little. At 16, I earned direct admission to a prestigious city high school. I came home with the acceptance letter in my fist, ready for once to surprise Mrs. Q with something good. Instead, I found her on the floor, her face gray, her breath shallow. The ambulance ride was loud. Sirens sliced the air. My senses buckled the way they had when I was small. In the hospital, Mrs. Q's body became fragile in a way I had never allowed myself to imagine. My aunt appeared after years of distance, eyes swollen, kneeling beside the bed and begging for forgiveness. Mrs. Q woke long enough to curse her, to ask where her husband was, to spit bitter lessons about men and disaster. I stood in the hallway because the room was too noisy with grief and history. There, by a window smeared with rain, a teenager leaned against the sill, hands in his pockets, hair falling into his eyes like he didn't care about the world's rules. He smiled at me as if he had known me for years. "Your era," he said, using the English nickname my teacher once wrote on my file and that only a few people knew. I froze. "Who are you?" I asked. "Vin Lam," he said. "It's complicated. I'm family, but not the kind your grandmother likes." Then he held out a piece of chocolate, the wrapper crinkling softly. Something in my memory clicked. A small boy in my childhood neighborhood, offering sweetness in a time when sweetness felt illegal. I had kept that chocolate too long until it melted and earned me another scolding. Lam watched my face and tilted his head. "You remember," he said quietly. "After the banquet scandal, my father moved his household to a larger city almost overnight, chasing new markets and new faces that didn't know his history. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't ask how I was healing. He simply vanished from the neighborhood like a man changing his clothes." Mrs. Kyo watched the moving trucks from our balcony with a look that was half victory and half hunger. "He ran," she said. "Coward." But her victory tasted bitter because it didn't resurrect my mother, and it didn't heal the bruises that already lived under my skin. As I grew older, I realized my grandmother's anger was a form of grief she could control. Grief is chaotic. Anger has direction. Sometimes she would tell me, over and over, the same two lessons. That my father had abandoned my mother, and that love made women stupid. She told those lessons the way people recite prayers, hoping repetition could turn pain into protection. I listened, because I had been trained to listen, but I also began to notice what she never said. She never spoke about my mother's laughter, her favorite food, the way she might have held me when no one was watching. My mother existed in our home mostly as a wound. That was why my mother's notebook shook me so much later it gave her back a voice that was more than tragedy. Mrs. Q died on an ordinary morning, the kind of morning the world loves to use as camouflage. A nurse came to check vitals, and found the stillness first. My aunt collapsed, wailing, her grief loud enough to shake the hallway. I stood at the foot of the bed and waited for my own body to join her. for tears to arrive like they did in movies. Nothing came. I felt a hollow calm, the same calm I had felt when my mother died, when screaming stopped and the house turned quiet. Lamb stood beside me with his hands folded, his mouth tight. "You're not sad?" he asked softly, not accusing, only trying to understand. I searched for the right answer and found only honesty. "I'm full," I said. "Like I've been carrying noise for so long there's no room for more." Lamb nodded as if that made sense. At the funeral, people arrived with incense and rehearsed condolences. Mrs. Q's neighbors whispered that she had been a fierce woman, that she had raised me alone, that she deserved peace. My father did not come at first. Then he arrived late, in a clean suit, flanked by Lan and Kwang, as if the family portrait still belonged to him. He tried to approach the altar. My aunt stepped in front of him, shaking. Lamb watched my father the way you watch a car you don't trust to stop at a crosswalk. My father's gaze slid to me, and for a moment he seemed to calculate whether I was now a liability or an asset. I realized, with a cold clarity, that Mrs. Kyo's death did not free me from family. It merely changed the terms. After the burial, when the guests drifted away, a lawyer arrived with a brown envelope. Mrs. Q had left a will, short and blunt. Everything she owned, apartment, savings, the dusty sewing box, the old tea tin, went to me. There was one additional item, a notebook wrapped in kitchen twine, addressed in my mother's handwriting. My hands trembled as I held it, not from fear of paper, but from fear of what it might contain. Living with Mrs. Q meant living inside her rules, which were simpler than love and harder than kindness. She woke early, cleaned as if dust were a moral failing, and kept receipts in a folder so thick it could have been a doorstop. "Money is safety," she told me. "If you don't have it, you have to beg, and begging makes you small." She did not believe in therapy at first. She believed in endurance. When the school offered counseling after my IQ test, she frowned as if someone had suggested I was broken. But I kept going because the counselor's office was quiet and the counselor spoke slowly, giving my brain time to catch up with sound. They taught me how to name sensations before they became panic. The itch behind my eyes before a meltdown. The buzzing in my ears before I needed silence. The tightness in my chest before I started to shut down. They taught me that communication could be a tool and not a performance. I learned to ask for dimmer lights. I learned to carry earplugs. I learned to step out of rooms without apologizing. Mrs. Q complained about the time it took, but she still walked me to the bus stop on counseling days and waited until the bus swallowed me. Her way of showing care without admitting she felt it. On days when I came home overwhelmed, she would set a bowl of plain porridge on the table and pretend it was nothing, as if nourishment were just another chore. In those quiet meals, I started to build something inside myself that had never existed in my father's home: predictability. That night, alone in the apartment that suddenly belonged to me, I opened the notebook. My mother's writing was neat, controlled, the kind of handwriting you use when you are trying not to shake. She wrote about my father's debts, about his affair before he admitted it, about Lan's pregnancy long before the remarriage. She wrote about hospital bills, about my bruises, about the shame of feeling trapped. Then, in the middle of a paragraph, her tone changed. She wrote about a set of pills she kept hidden, not as a plan at first, but as an idea she hated and could not stop touching. She wrote, "If I disappear, please don't tell them I was weak. Tell them I was tired." My throat tightened. Mrs. Q had told everyone my mother had no will to live, as if it were a moral failure. Now I saw it as a diagnosis: exhaustion, isolation, a body that stopped believing rescue was possible. Between pages, receipts were tucked like pressed flowers, medical invoices, screenshots printed on cheap paper, a bank transfer slip. My father's signature appeared again and again. In the tea tin, beneath sewing needles and spare buttons, I found an old USB drive. I didn't even own a laptop with a port for it. I walked to an internet cafe at midnight and paid for an hour. The files were labeled in my grandmother's harsh handwriting: proof, audio recordings, messages, photos. One recording caught my breath. My father arguing with a doctor about my mother's condition, insisting on discharging her early, because the hospital was expensive, and he had important meetings. My mother's voice was in the background, faint, pleading, apologizing for being a burden. I listened until my hands went numb. In the cafe's blue light, I finally cried, not the loud, childlike sob of years ago, but a quiet, steady leaking, as if my body had decided it was safe to let water out. Lamb waited outside the cafe without me asking. He had bought 2 soy milks from a street stall and held one out like an offering. "You didn't have to," I said, voice rough. "I know," he replied. "That's why I did." Over the next weeks, he became my witness. Lamb was the illegitimate son of my aunt's husband. My aunt had married into another complicated story, one that carried the same surname as the boy who once gave me chocolate. Lamb had grown up half in, half out of his own family, tolerated when useful, ignored when inconvenient. He recognized the shape of my pain because it mirrored his. We sorted the files together on borrowed computers, making a timeline the way detectives do when feelings are too chaotic to hold. Officer Tran returned my call after hearing Mrs. Q had died. Her voice softened when she said, "I'm sorry." She explained what could be done. A civil protection order, a formal statement, potential charges depending on statutes and evidence. The problem was time. Much of the physical abuse happened years ago, in a household that would deny it with practiced unity. But the digital evidence about my mother, about my father's neglect, financial coercion, and possible tampering with medication opened other doors. My father began calling as soon as he learned about the will. He said I should come home. He said the apartment belonged to the family, and I was too young to manage it. He offered to take care of the paperwork, his voice smooth in the way a hand is smooth before it closes. Lon messaged too, using fake warmth. "We worry about you, dear. Come back so we can be a proper family again." I did not answer either of them. Instead, I visited a legal aid office with my documents stacked like armor. A counselor named Ms. Harper listened, then spoke plainly. "You're 17. We can petition for emancipation or for guardianship arrangements through the court, depending on the jurisdiction. You have evidence. You also have a right to be safe." It was the first time someone said right and meant me. My father escalated when kindness failed. He arrived at the apartment building with Kwang in tow, using the boy as a shield. Kwang was 9 by then, small, eager to please, trained to smile the way my father smiled. "Sister," he said uncertainly when he saw me, and the word landed strangely, like an object thrown from a distance. I felt a pang that wasn't love or hate but recognition. Kwang was a child in the same machine that crushed me. My father tried to push past the threshold. Lamb stepped in front of him with a polite posture and an impolite firmness. "You can't enter," Lamb said. "This property belongs to her now." My father's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" Lamb smiled slightly. "Family you didn't pay attention to." My father's anger flared, but he kept it contained because neighbors were watching. He performed injured dignity. He accused me of being ungrateful, of being manipulated, of dishonoring my mother's memory. I thought of my mother's notebook and the sentence about being tired. I looked my father in the eye and said, calmly, "Don't use her like a prop. You already did that when she was alive." The words shocked him into silence for half a second, and that half second felt like power. Officer Tran arrived minutes later because Lamb had called ahead. My father stepped back, smiling too widely, insisting he was only concerned. Officer Tran asked him to leave. She used the same calm tone she had used in the hospital years ago, and the calmness made it impossible to argue without sounding guilty. My father left, but not before turning to me and saying, very softly, "You will regret this." I waited for fear to flood me the way it used to. It didn't. Maybe grief had burned some circuits clean. Maybe safety plans did their job. Lamb stood beside me and murmured, "Regret is his hobby. Don't borrow it." The court process did not feel like revenge. It felt like paperwork dragging bruises into the light. Ms. Harper filed motions. Officer Tran submitted notes. Nurse Dao signed an affidavit about what she observed that day in the emergency room. My father hired a lawyer who spoke in smooth phrases about family reconciliation and teenage confusion. Lan cried in court, claiming I had always been difficult, claiming Mrs. Q poisoned me, claiming she tried her best. I listened without interrupting because interrupting was what they expected, a stereotype they could label as instability. When it was my turn, I did not perform sadness. I simply told the timeline, steady, factual, as if I were presenting a math proof. I described the burns from soup, the bruises from belts, the accidents that occurred whenever adults were angry. I described my mother's collapse and my father's impatience with the hospital bill. I presented the notebook. I played the audio. The judge did not gasp the way movies promised. The judge merely frowned, which, in that room, meant the truth had landed. The ruling granted me temporary independent custody over myself and placed restrictions on my father's contact. Additional investigations into financial coercion and negligence were opened. My father's business partners heard about the case. Again, he lost face. Again, he lost opportunity. Kwang's school began asking questions. Lan's family stopped answering her calls. My father, for the first time, looked like a man who realized his story could no longer be controlled. I should have felt satisfied. Instead, I felt exhausted. Justice did not erase the past. It only rearranged the future so I could breathe. After the hearings, life became quietly unfamiliar. With Ms. Harper's help, I applied for scholarships and moved to the city school dorms earlier than planned. Mrs. Q's apartment remained mine, rented out to pay for tuition. But I kept the tea tin and my mother's notebook close, because some objects feel like anchors. Lam visited on weekends, bringing snacks and sarcastic commentary about my overpacked schedule. He was careful not to treat me like glass. He treated me like a person, which was rarer. Sometimes we talked about my mother. Sometimes we didn't. Sometimes I stared at a crowded cafeteria and felt the old sensory storm rising, and Lam would quietly steer me toward a quieter corner without making it a spectacle. I learned to use noise-canceling headphones without shame. I learned to say, "I need a break," without apologizing. I learned that my body belonged to me, not to fear, not to family. I also learned that anger is not always poison. Sometimes it's fuel you can direct into something useful. I volunteered at a small clinic, filing records, translating for older patients, watching nurses do their work with competence that felt like love in a uniform. Nurse Dao recognized me one day and smiled softly, as if seeing me standing upright was its own kind of closure. "You did well," she said. I wanted to correct her, tell her I hadn't done anything heroic. I had only survived, but then I remembered that surviving is work too. So I said, "Thank you," and let the gratitude land. My father tried a new tactic a year later. He sent gifts. A fancy pen set, a designer bag, a phone upgrade. Each package came with a note about family and forgiveness, written in careful handwriting that wasn't his. Lan must have written them, trying to rebrand guilt as generosity. I returned every package unopened. When the last one came, Lam asked if I ever wondered what it would feel like to forgive. I thought for a long moment before answering. "Forgiveness isn't a performance," I said. "It's a decision. I haven't decided, and I don't owe them the version of me that makes them comfortable." Lam nodded, satisfied. On my 18th birthday, I legally changed my surname. It wasn't about erasing my father. It was about refusing to carry him as an introduction. I kept my mother's name in the middle because she had been erased too easily in life, and I refused to cooperate with that erasure. I visited my mother's grave alone with a small packet of jasmine tea and the notebook under my arm. I told her, out loud, that she was not weak. I told her I was sorry she had been tired. I told her I would build a life where tiredness did not automatically become a trap. The wind moved through the cemetery trees, and for once the silence felt like a hand on my shoulder rather than a weight on my throat. During my first year in the city school dorms, I kept expecting disaster to arrive with the mail. That is the problem with surviving childhood harm. Your nervous system becomes an overqualified security guard, scanning every shadow for danger. I jumped at sudden knocks. I avoided crowded elevators. I studied with my back to walls. My roommate once dropped a stack of books, and I flinched so hard my chair tipped. She apologized, horrified, and I laughed too loudly to reassure her, then cried in the bathroom because my body still believed it was trapped. Ms. Harper taught me practical rituals: list safe contacts, plan exits, keep copies of documents, write down threats when they happen instead of letting them fog my memory. Officer Tran reminded me that asking for help was not weakness, it was procedure, and procedures exist because humans are fragile. Lam, in his own way, taught me that safety could be warm, not just locked. He would sit beside me in silence when I couldn't talk. He would crack stupid jokes when my mind spiraled. He would leave when I asked for space and return later without punishment. One evening, after I aced an exam and expected to feel joy, I only felt numb. Lam bought cheap cake from a corner bakery and stuck a single candle in it right there on my dorm desk. "We celebrate anyway," he said. I stared at the tiny flame and realized celebration was not a feeling that arrived. It was a choice you practiced until your body learned it was allowed. I blew out the candle, and the smoke curled up like a question. And for the first time in a long time, the question did not terrify me. Kwang appeared in my life again when he turned 12 and started asking questions. Children are not supposed to ask in families like ours. He wrote to me from a new number, hesitant, full of typos. He said Dad was angry all the time. He said Lan cried in the kitchen. He said he didn't understand why I left. I stared at his message for a long time. I had promised myself I would not be pulled back into my father's gravity. But Kwang was not my father. He was a boy raised inside the same building that once used me as a punching bag. I replied with boundaries. I could meet in a public place. I would not come to their house. I would not speak to my father. Lam came with me, sitting at a nearby table, not hovering but present. Kwang arrived, clutching a backpack, his uniform collar slightly crooked, his eyes darting like a sparrow. He looked at me and seemed startled that I was real. "You're different," he said. "So are you," I replied. Over iced tea, he asked if Dad loved me. I did not lie. Dad loved what I could do for him. I said gently, "That's not the same thing." Kwang swallowed hard, and I watched a child's worldview crack. I hated my father for that moment, for forcing his son into the same painful education. Kwang asked what he should do. I told him the only answer that felt true. Learn to recognize safety. Find teachers, friends, adults who don't use you, and remember that you can leave someday. He nodded as if I had handed him a secret map. When he left, Lam exhaled and said, "You did the right thing." I shrugged, but my chest ached. Helping Kwang didn't heal me. It just proved I was not obligated to repeat cruelty, even when it came with familiar faces. Years passed, not with cinematic closure, but with incremental repairs. I graduated, studied statistics and health systems, because patterns made sense to my brain, and because I wanted to understand why some people fall through cracks and others are caught. I worked at a research office, then at a community health organization, turning numbers into recommendations that might keep someone else safer than I had been. Lam drifted in and out of the city for jobs, always returning with stories and snacks, and an infuriating ability to make me laugh when my mind got too tight. People liked to ask if Lam and I were together, romantic, official. We never rushed to label it. We had been raised in families where labels were used as weapons. We preferred to build trust like a house, slowly, with inspections and solid foundations. One evening, when we were older and the world finally felt less like a threat, Lam stood in my kitchen and held up my mother's notebook like it was a fragile relic. "You know," he said, "you didn't just survive. You changed the story." I stirred soup and watched steam rise, remembering boiling broth on a hospital floor, remembering pain. "I didn't change the past," I said. Lam smiled. "No, but you changed the ending." I thought about Mrs. Kyo's harsh love, about my mother's tired handwriting, about Officer Tran waiting for my words, about Nurse Dao refusing to ignore bruises. I thought about Kwang holding his backpack like a shield. I set the ladle down and admitted, quietly, "I'm still changing it." Lam leaned his shoulder against mine. Warm and steady. Outside, rain stitched the streetlights into trembling lines, but inside, the room held. For the first time, I understood peace as something ordinary, a door that locked, a hand that didn't hurt, a future that did not require permission. People like to imagine healing as a straight line, but mine moved like a tide. Some weeks I felt invincible, taking the train alone, speaking in meetings, laughing loudly. Other weeks a smell cheap cologne in an elevator. Hospital antiseptic on someone's hands would drag me back into the old corridor of fear. On those days I practiced a different kind of bravery. I texted Lam instead of disappearing. I called my counselor instead of pretending I was fine. I ate dinner even when my stomach insisted it didn't deserve food. I kept a small list taped inside my notebook.